Hello, and welcome to the ninth Christian History mini lecture. Today, we're going to be discussing the topic of science in the ancient world. We have a couple objectives for today. Firstly, you'll be able to explain how natural philosophy developed over the course of antiquity. And secondly, you'll be able to explain the basic incompatibilities between the Christian worldview and various pagan natural philosophies. Now, we are taking a bit of a break from the main sequence, our timeline that we've been going through. And you might be wondering, we've been studying medieval Christian history. Why is it that we're going back and learning about ancient science? And the answer is, if you remember from the last lecture, we ended on the point that the rediscovery of Aristotelian natural philosophy, the rediscovery of Aristotelian science, it has a huge impact on the way that Christians think, and it poses some interesting problems that Christians are going to encounter. Aristotelian science deeply impacts Christian theology. And in order for you to understand really what that impact was and why it's meaningful, it's important that we just have some background information on Aristotelian natural philosophy and how it differed from other philosophical paradigms. Now, in the modern world, we think of science as a field of study that is, in a real sense, insulated from philosophy and religion. There's an unbridgeable gap between science and philosophy. Science, we say, is the objective study of things, right? I can, through scientific inquiry, come to realize that on Earth, the acceleration of gravity is around 9.8 meters per second per second. I can tell you the chemical composition of a substance, of a fluid, whereas philosophy and religion, right, it studies not what a thing is materially, but it rather teaches me what a thing means. Okay, science cannot tell me what a thing means. It does not tell me how I ought to act. That is the realm of philosophy and religion. Now, in the pre-modern world, however, this dichotomy was not recognized. Before modernity, there was not this understanding that science and philosophy were different fields of study. Science was philosophy, natural philosophy. And there was this deep conviction all throughout the Middle Ages that scientific inquiry is not to be divorced from moral instruction. I can, through observing nature, observing creation, come to understand certain moral precepts. This is also an idea that we see within scripture. Read the book of Proverbs, and you'll see that there are encouragements for us to look at certain aspects of nature and to realize that God is communicating to us certain moral ideas through the natural world. So it's important for us to sort of break out of this idea that science and philosophy are completely insulated from each other. That's not the case, and it's not the way that the pre-modern world thought. Now, now, in accordance with that previous point, I'd like to note that natural philosophy and science emerged from religion, that there was a religious substrate, a mythological substrate and foundation from which natural philosophy emerged and sprouted up. In the ancient world, peoples believed that natural phenomena were caused by the gods and governed by fate. There was this belief that there are divinities and spirits whose actions are visible to us in some of the natural events which occur. Everything from the sun rising to rain coming down to thunder. Think, for instance, of ancient Greek or of ancient Norse mythologies. Now, these polytheistic religions often portrayed these gods as being in conflict with each other, and that conflict could sometimes be the cause of what we might come to understand to be the more chaotic and violent aspects of nature. But a lot of polytheistic religions tended to view the gods as being individuals who themselves were governed by an overarching fate. Um, People looked out at the world and came to understand, nature seems to be both ordered and chaotic. If I drop a rock, it will fall down every single time. That's order, right? The world and nature itself seems to be patterned. Think of the fact that we have four seasons, right? And you can always count on summer coming after spring. There is a consistency to nature. And yet there's also an inconsistency to nature. There's a chaos. Sometimes there's a flood that occurs in the valley. Sometimes there is a famine. Sometimes there are kind of freak of nature natural phenomena that occur that we don't have natural or rational explanations for at the time, at least. So it made a lot of sense to these peoples to understand that these were the actions of gods who could be fickle sometimes. Now, there was a keen interest in developing an understanding of nature at the time. And the reason was because of the fact that in the pre-modern world, especially the modern world too, but in the pre-modern world, there was this understanding that knowledge of nature aids in survival. Um, People felt often at the mercy of natural forces, but there was an understanding, if I understand the seasons, if I understand climate, if I understand what grows in what soil, what are the conditions necessary for growing foods, how can I deal with ailments, so on and so forth, that is going to help me and my clan survive. Um, People during this time period were also deeply fascinated with the stars, with the planets. Imagine the night sky in the pre-modern world, how brightly those stars and planets and other celestial bodies would have appeared and looked to them. These individuals would often look up at the sky and look for signs in it, right? They would try to understand what the meaning of the position of various stars were. This is a field of study that we will refer to as astrology, which is a field of study in which individuals try to find signs within the heavens that will help us understand how we ought to live or help us predict the future, things like that. Blood sacrifices were very common in ancient religions, and this was a kind of flawed science, right? Why? Because people often drew a correlation between natural phenomena and their own actions. They often believed that the gods were very angry with them, and that we can attain salvation through the appeasement of divine wrath. Throughout cultures, like across cultures, there was this deep understanding that someone's angry with us, that humanity has done something wrong, that we're on the bad side of someone, that there's a curse upon humanity, and that we need to appease this curse through shedding of blood. And often this was animals, but sometimes this also included human sacrifices. Now, natural philosophy progresses, right, and actually becomes truly philosophy and not merely religion, we tend to think of the pre-Socratics, the Greek pre-Socratics as the individuals who really brought the world much, much further in terms of developing rational explanations for reality. So the pre-Socratics were individuals who were less likely to kind of argue that gods were behind the movements of various natural forces, and instead they sought natural explanations for natural phenomena. Thales is a famous pre-Socratic philosopher who predicted an eclipse. He was able to, through studying astronomical data, predict that an eclipse would occur. And according to legend, his prediction rang true. And that shocked people because it demonstrated to people that the celestial bodies and celestial movements and astronomy, it's not just the movement and the will of the gods, that is also a natural phenomena. Thales also, like other pre-Socratic philosophers, was obsessed with trying to find an ultimate reality. Is there a reality which underlies all other natural realities? And Thales believed that it was water. Others argued that it was fire or air, so on and so forth. Empedocles was a philosopher who argued that there are four elements which comprise all things, right? Fire, water, earth, and air. These four elements correlate with, heat and coldness and dryness and wetness, and that a mixture, a combination of those four elements would result in various different substances. Now, Plato really builds on some of the foundation of these pre-Socratic philosophers, including the great philosopher Pythagoras, who believed that ultimate reality was actually number, which is abstract. Plato argued that the material physical reality that I engage with, that I live in, is not the ultimate reality, that there is a realm, he refers to this as the realm of the forms, which contains deeper realities. He believed that the physical world and everything in it was really a lesser imperfect shadow, right, of a deeper reality. For instance, and this is the typical example, think of a physical chair. Right? There are various different chairs. Some chairs might be more effective, and then other chairs more comfortable, more useful. Um, and yet, there that common quality, chairness between all chairs, that quality itself is an abstraction. There is a perfect idea, a form of a chair that all these physical chairs are lesser instantiations of. And let me give you another example, circles, right? You have never seen a perfect circle. Every circle that you've ever seen, that you've ever drawn, that you've ever seen on a screen, uh, every single circle you've seen is imperfect, right? It'll have jagged edges if you look at it close enough, but that doesn't mean that there is no such thing as a circle. There is a perfect circle, an ideal circle that exists in the realm of the forms, and every physical circle or other shape that I see is really a lesser copy of a deeper reality. Now, because of this, because the physical world is imperfect, it's shadow, it's lesser, uh, we should distrust the senses, right? The senses are not the perfect source of knowledge, although it's important for me to take into account sensory data. And as a consequence, Plato really does emphasize reason and deductive logic to help us arrive at the truth. Sometimes what I see is not the whole picture. I need to delve deeper and arrive at deeper, invisible truths. Now, Plato did believe in a god. He refers to him as the demiurge, the creator, the designer, the craftsman. Plato believed that the demiurge, this creator god, created the world, and that he created beings who in turn created the physical world. Now, because the world was created by a rational creator, natural laws, right, the consistency and order that I see within the physical world reflects a divine spiritual reason. The physical world, as I mentioned before, is changing and imperfect. Things die, things decay. That is the nature of this world. And therefore, right, we ought to not bind ourselves to the physical world. There's a deeper spiritual pleasure that we are to gain, a deeper spiritual happiness that we can arrive at through contemplating the form of the good. Plato was also interested in the stars because this world was created according to a rational pattern. He believed that this applied to astronomy, right? He believed that there were celestial spheres that revolve around the Earth. This is going to have a huge impact on medieval astronomy. Now, Aristotle, Plato's student, was quite different than Plato, had a huge, huge impact on the way that the Western world came to understand nature. We come to view Aristotle as the father of empirical science. And he's referred to as the father of empirical science because what we will refer to now as the scientific method has its roots in Aristotle's writings and teachings. Aristotle operated on a different epistemology or theory of knowledge than Plato. Aristotle believed, unlike Plato, that knowledge is gained through the senses, whereas Plato tended to distrust the senses. Aristotle says no, like the senses are the principle of knowledge. So through senses, I can observe things which occur within the world, which I remember, and that in turn fuels and emerges into intuition and finally understanding. And because all of the things which I come to understand are through the senses, that means that I can trust them. It means that I can trust my own individual experiences. There is therefore an emphasis on not merely deductive logic, but also on inductive logic. Okay. If I were to see a duck and the duck had two wings, and I see another duck and it had two wings, and I see another duck and it has two wings, I can arrive at the rational conclusion that it's most likely that all ducks have two wings, that this is normative. That's an example of me using inductive logic, and that's sort of the foundation for the scientific method. Now, Aristotle, who pays much closer attention to the physical world and doesn't sort of dismiss it as much as Plato does, believe that the material universe has no beginning. The world was never created. It's always been here. And we don't have time to talk more about, why he thought that that was the case. It had to do with his definition of time. Now, Aristotle, however, did believe that there was a god. He referred to him as the unmoved mover. He argued we live in a world in which things are constantly moving. But a thing cannot move unless it was moved by something else. And you can trace that all the way back, and you have to conclude that there must have been a first mover who was not himself moved. That's sort of his vision of a god. Although Aristotle did not believe that the unmoved mover loved humanity, he didn't believe that the unmoved mover understood or knew creation. Not that Aristotle would have called it creation, but he did not believe that this unmoved mover cared about us or was aware of us. And that's going to raise some problems when we get to Christian implementation of Aristotelian philosophy. Aristotle also argued that all motion and change is caused by the nature of things. And this relates to the concept of telos, right? If I were to hold a rock, okay, so pretend this is a rock, and I were to drop it, it falls downwards every time. Whereas fire, I've actually got a candle over here. I don't know if you can see that. Fire moves upwards. And why is that the case? And the answer is because of the nature of the thing. There is something in the rock that wants to go down. It has a telos, an end, right? Everything which occurs has a nature, and that nature tends toward a certain direction, and that accounts for movement, all natural intrinsic movement. A telos is the end which a thing's nature pursues. Human beings have a telos, and the pursuit of that telos, the right pursuit, that's living a virtuous life. Now, Aristotle also pioneers the field of biology like no one else did before him. Maybe King Solomon. Now, Aristotle is famous for sorting animals into various categories. He creates a whole taxonomy for understanding animals, this idea of the animal kingdom. It relates back to Aristotle's understanding of biology. Now, Aristotle believed that all organisms are composites, right? We have matter and we have souls, right? We have bodies and souls. And Aristotle argued that an organism's soul is the form of the organism's matter. He didn't believe that you could extract form from matter. Like if I, for instance, had my phone, I can't take the form of the phone and put it here, the shape, and I can't take the matter of the phone and put it in a formless pile on the other side of my screen, right? They are inextricable realities. And this relates to Aristotle's conviction that the soul could not exist apart from the body, that if the body was destroyed, the soul would be destroyed as well. Aristotle did not believe in an afterlife. Now, Plato and Aristotle had a huge impact on what we'll refer to as Hellenistic science. Um, Let me explain that term really quickly. When I say Hellenistic, I am referring to the larger Greek-speaking world after the conquests of Alexander. When Alexander the Great went out and conquered much of the known world, he spread the Greek language and Greek culture and Greek philosophy with him. As a matter of fact, when he would go out on his campaigns, he would collect specimens of various animals and plants, and he would send them back to his teacher, Aristotle, who was very interested in categorizing animals and plants, as we've discussed earlier. Now, all of a sudden, you have much of the known world speaking the same language. And because they're speaking a common language, a common tongue, you'll understand that doing this enables the transfer and the spread of ideas at a pace and on a scale that was just unprecedented at this point. One famous Hellenistic philosopher was a guy by the name of Claudius Ptolemy. Claudius Ptolemy was a famous astronomer who constructed a mathematically precise model of the universe. This was a geocentric model. Ptolemy believed that the Earth was at the center of the universe. Yes, the ancient Greeks believed that the Earth was round. There's a myth going around that, the pre-modern world, they believe that the earth was flat. That's not the case. The medievals did not believe that either. Now, Ptolemy believed that the planets and the stars revolved around the earth, and he was actually able to create a model that was um, mathematically precise, and also that accounted for retrograde motion. If you look out at the night sky and if you were to track the movements of various planets, you'll see that they seem to sort of move on an orbit, but then they kind of move backwards. That's retrograde motion. And Ptolemy created a system of epicycles. He believed that the planets sort of revolved around in orbit, and in so doing, he was able to calculate where a planet would be on any given day. And you could use Ptolemy's model to predict the location of a heavenly body years in advance. It was that precise. Um, as you can imagine, that deeply impacts the way that people engage in astronomy and view the stars. You also have advances in medicine. There was a famous physician by the name of Galen, and Galen uses the insights from previous philosophers to classify diseases. He believed that human health is dependent on equilibrium, that there's a homeostasis, a stable, harmonious state of the human body. And when that harmony, when that homeostasis, when that equilibrium is disrupted, when there is a lack of balance in my body, that's when I have disease. And he created a whole manual that would help individuals identify diseases and treat them. Galen adopted a highly Platonic vision of the human, although he does, pull from Aristotelian biology as well. He believed that the human was split up into rational, spirited, and appetitive. The brain, for instance, is a rational organ. The heart is a spirited organ. You think of your guts, the groin area, that's appetitive. Now, Galen believed that the human body was comprised of organs, that those organs were comprised of tissues, and the building blocks of human organisms, are humors. There are fluid substances that flow throughout our body, and when there's an imbalance of humors, then you have, uh, different problems, right? Like emotional or physical sickness and illness. And the key to healing disease was balancing those humors. Um, we also have the prominence of Stoicism and Epicureanism during the Roman era. Stoicism and Epicureanism are two philosophies that actually we see mentioned in Scripture. Paul, in Acts chapter 17, is in Athens, and there are Stoics and Epicureans there, the two prominent philosophies of the day. Now, Stoicism is a philosophy that asserts that the world is organic, that the world is governed by a divine logos. We live in a rationally ordered universe, and all human beings are made sort of in the image of that one divine logos that governs all things. And that to be truly happy, to live a good life, is to make sure that I am living in harmony with that divine law, with that divine reason. Epicureans, on the other hand, were remembered and viewed as being much more materialistic than the Stoics, who seemed a little bit more spiritual and Platonic. The Epicureans believed, like Aristotle, that the universe is eternal and that it's comprised of indivisible atoms. That if you were to break all things, all elements down, you would find that there are atoms that you cannot divide beyond what they are that comprise the entire universe. Epicurus believed that the universe is essentially material, right? And this has a huge impact on the way that Epicureans live. They have a reputation for being hedonistic, the idea that pleasure is really the only thing that is worth striving for. We avoid pain, we pursue pleasure. This is going to echo in the modern era in classical utilitarianism. Now, I'd like to finish our lecture with just an overview of some important agreements and disagreements between Christianity and various pagan natural philosophies, because these agreements and disagreements are going to have a huge impact on future debates within the church. Um, Christians agree with certain aspects of ancient polytheistic mythologies. We agree that God is actively involved in the world, that when there is a hurricane or when rain falls or when a rock falls off any mountain, that is not just pure accident, but that God is in control of all of those things. The Bible says so. We agree that a sacrifice must be made to appease divine wrath. We believe that human suffering is a consequence of human sin, and that we must be delivered from the wrath of God, and we're delivered through the sacrifice of Jesus. There are, however, disagreements with ancient mythologies. Unlike ancient polytheistic religions, Christians believe that there is only one God, and he's perfect. He's not a petty tyrant who engages in petty disagreements with and conflicts with other equal gods. No, God is perfect. We believe that all things are governed by divine loving providence, not impersonal fate. If there is such a thing as fate, we would define fate as sort of the outcomes that are themselves governed by God's loving plan. Christians also believe that Christ is the only true sacrifice for sin. We do not believe that the blood of bulls and goats can truly, in and of themselves, atone for our sin and appease the wrath of God, as Hebrews teaches us. Uh, People in the Old Covenant who sacrificed animals, their sins were remitted as a consequence of their faith in a promise. Um, Now, back to agreements, there are certain things that Christians agree with Plato on. We agree that God purposefully created the world. We agree that our present world is passing away and that there's a deeper spiritual reality than what we can see, than what is merely physical. There's a flesh and spirit dichotomy in Scripture, right? We should live according to the spirit, not according to the flesh. And yet we disagree with certain aspects of Plato. We believe that the physical world, that the physical human body included, is created good by a perfect God. Plato believed that a demiurge created the universe, but that there were certain creatures and offspring who went on and created the physical world and created human beings, which is why there are problems with the human soul, which is why the physical world is imperfect, because the demiurge did not create it himself directly. Whereas Christians believe that God directly created the world and he called it good. We spoiled it through our sin and disobedience. We disagree with Plato, Plato's assertion that prudence, that reason is the highest virtue. Christians believe that love is the highest virtue, right? Think of Paul saying, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. We agree with the Aristotelian idea that all things have a purpose and a telos, right? We agree with the Aristotelian belief that the soul and the body are deeply interconnected, that human beings are embodied souls and not merely spirits that are trapped within the prison of a body, as Plato asserts. However, there are disagreements. Christians disagree with Aristotle's assertion that the universe had no beginning. We believe that God created the heavens and the earth, and that the universe, there was a time in which it did not exist and there was only God. We disagree with the assertion that the soul is destroyed upon death. No, we don't believe that. We believe that after death, the soul lives on. And that disagreement is actually the reason why the early church tended to favor Plato over Aristotle. It's because Plato believed in a spiritual afterlife and Aristotle did not. We agree with certain aspects of Stoic philosophy. We believe that the universe is governed by the Logos, by divine reason, and that humans are made in God's image. But we disagree with the Stoics. We don't think that the Stoics had a clear enough distinction between creator and creature. The Stoics believed in a nature that was essentially divine. Um, and Christians don't agree with that. We believe that God transcends nature. He's distinct from the world. Stoicism, it tends to err on sort of the side of pantheism or panentheism. Panentheism is the belief that all things are kind of within the mind of God, whereas Christians believe that creation is distinct from God, that God transcends it. Um, and these are just some of the agreements and disagreements. And you'll imagine that Christians over the course of the Middle Ages are going to struggle sometimes figuring out how to walk the fine line of accepting the best ideas and insights of pagan philosophy, but rejecting certain dangerous ideas that are antithetical to our faith and might actually compromise Christian doctrine. And the sad thing is that many Christian theologians thought that they were walking that fine line, but they weren't. They were falling off either edge. Um, we haven't yet discussed Epicureanism, and that's because the medievals, while aware of Epicureanism, tended not to really view it as a useful philosophy. But Epicurean atomism is going to emerge again in the early modern world, which we'll discuss at the very, very end of this series. All right, I hope that you all enjoyed this lecture. I'll see you all in the next one.